So I was back in Sweden recently on holiday, and me and my girlfriend and my brother and a good friend of mine decided we were going to watch a film. A Norwegian film, in fact, to which my friend cried out, "No, Norwegian? Norwegian is the only language that I actually don't like how it sounds. I even like Danish. I think Danish sounds great, but Norwegian is just so silly." And yeah, I mean, the language did perhaps add extra comedic value to the film. I don't think it was helped by the fact that the film was Netflix's royal teen, but still, why do I, as a native Swedish speaker, find it impossible not to find Norwegian just a little bit funny? But what I don't find funny at all is your data ending up in the wrong hands, which is why this video is sponsored by Incogni. When you are out on the internet looking up fun linguistics facts, data brokers are there to collect your personal information, including your name, logins, associated addresses, and online activity, which they then sell for profit to marketing agencies and businesses, leaving you open to spam emails, text messages, and spam calls, or even, worst case scenario, to identity theft. Now, of course, if you were to request companies to delete your data in the EU, UK, US, and Canada, they'd be legally required to do so. But where would you even start? Are you just going to spend the rest of your life tracking down and sending removal requests to every single company that has this? With Incogni, this is all automated, and any time a new record pops up on a data broker site, Incogni takes care of it for you, sending as many requests as required to take back your data. All you need to do is create an account, grant them the right to work for you, and your bit is done. And if you use the code KKLEIN when you sign up, you'll get 60% off an annual plan. Thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Now, Swedish and Norwegian are North Germanic languages, descended from Old Norse. There are a few ways to classify language groups in general, and one is using a strict branching model, which typically looks at where languages become separated from each other historically, and there creates a separation. This leads to a classification that considers Swedish and Danish to be East Scandinavian, descended from East Old Norse, and Norwegian to be West Scandinavian, like Icelandic and Faroese, as it's descended from West Old Norse. Even this is a little simplified, as Old Norse was probably more of a dialect continuum than a set of languages with strict barriers, but there's a bigger problem here: mutual intelligibility. See, another more day-to-day useful classification of these languages is into continental and insular, because Norwegian is, because of Norway's geographical proximity and long-standing economic and political ties to Sweden and especially to Denmark, arguably more similar to Danish or Swedish than to Icelandic or Faroese. These continental Scandinavian languages can be said to have a degree of mutual intelligibility with one another, where speakers of one language can understand speakers of another, and vice versa. This intelligibility isn't always what it's made out to be. It's often asymmetrical, with one side understanding more than the other, and usually the Swedes understand the least, and varies a lot by dialect, and it certainly isn't perfect. Speakers aren't likely to understand every word of what each other are saying, but this kind of communication definitely happens all the time. If two Scandinavians meet, even if they're from different countries, they can simplify their speech and speak a little slower and clearer than usual, and it will generally work out quite nicely. Reading Norwegian, especially the Bokmål standard, or Danish, is incredibly easy for most Swedes, and if you engage in the media of, or spend some time in one of your fellow Scandinavian countries, you can pretty quickly learn the key differences in vocabulary and get used to the sentence rhythm, and it just becomes easier and easier to understand that language. It's not that they're the same, they're certainly not, but learning Danish as a Swede feels more like converting your native language than starting from zero and learning an entirely new one. And sometimes, when you hear Norwegian, it sounds just a little bit like someone putting on a silly voice while speaking a kind of children's secret language, where the secret is just to replace all the A's with E's at the end of words. You know, göra to göre, kvinna to kvinne, and so on. Other times, the grammar is slightly different, and because the rest of it sounds so similar, this difference feels odd and jarring. Like, in Swedish, we say min bil, my car, but in Norwegian it's usually bilen min, with a possessive pronoun after the noun, and the noun in the definite instead of indefinite form. Or you'll get a word that's kind of colloquial in Swedish, like snacka, which means to talk, but often more like to chat. But the Norwegian equivalent snakke is just the standard word, like å snakke norsk is how you say to speak Norwegian. Or unfortunate false friends, like snor, which is Norwegian for string, meaning snot in Swedish instead. And of course, since the rest of the words are just the same, the resulting sentence sounds a bit funny. I think to an extent, this is just inevitable with closely related languages. I know I've heard Polish speakers make fun of how Czech sounds, and though I don't know exactly why that is, I imagine it stems from a similar uncanny valley-esque effect. The silly valley, I don't know. But there is one linguistic feature of Norwegian that stands out, one that pushes it to the next level of silliness. It's intonation. Different languages have different intonation patterns over the course of sentences. These often change when emphasizing different words or phrases within the sentence, but English, for instance, usually has a pattern where in declarative statements the tone tends to fall slightly, but it tends to rise on questions. Swedish intonation is actually more complicated than I, as a native speaker, realized before researching this, but in most varieties, and at the very least in standard Swedish, it still has a downward tendency in statements. Vi går neråt på slutet av våra meningar. Norwegian also varies a lot by dialect, and obviously every sentence is different, but generally the pitch of a declarative statement rises, like here.
Hver eneste gang jeg skal ta toget til Oslo, det forsinket.
And observe the final syllable of certain phrases or clauses go sharply up.
Jeg våkna klokka 6:30 i dag. Til frokost spiste jeg 2 brødskiver med makrell i tomat. Jeg tok buss til universitetet.
This characteristic upward flick is, I think, what distinguishes my friend's perception of Norwegian from her perception of Danish, which also should fall into that uncanny valley for Swedes, but which my friend said she likes the sound of. And this phenomenon can be very clearly observed in the film we saw.
For det går litt store t-skjorter før, så kanskje de passer.
Du likte å være festens midtpunkt?
Det är trevligt att träffa Margaretes vänner.
Wait, actually, what's that last one? What's up with that one? What's up with the...
Det är trevligt att träffa Margaretes vänner.
See, this character in this film is debilitatingly depressed. Or something, I don't know, I didn't pay that much attention. She is speaking sadly and lethargically anyway, and my friend says she sounds like she's speaking Swedish. And she doesn't just sound like she's speaking Swedish. She is speaking Swedish. Scandinavian countries will often exchange actors for various productions, just chuck a Dane into a Swedish film or whatever, but that's not what this is. She isn't a native speaker, the actress is Norwegian and speaks Swedish in a Norwegian accent. That's what sounds a little off about it at first. But the subtitles insist she's speaking svensk, and she very clearly uses the word trevligt instead of the Norwegian hyggelig. The current Queen of Norway isn't Swedish, the actor isn't Swedish, this character never appears again in the film, and no explanation as to her Swedishness is ever given. No, I can only think of one reason that they would make the Queen speak Swedish, and that is to make her sound more depressed. And I've had a Norwegian say this openly to me as well. Swedish is, apparently, just a more depressing language in their view. And my hypothesis would be that this is because we go downward in our sentences as much as they go upward, but I'm not sure about that. Either way, since this character's only purpose in this film is to be depressed, I don't think it's far-fetched to say we're seeing a cultural association put on display here. One between Swedish and depression. At the end of the day, making fun of Norway and by extension the Norwegian language is basically just Swedish cultural practice, and to an extent the language also just sounds silly because all the jokes we're told say it sounds silly. It's similar, I think, to how English speakers always think Germans sound so aggressive because they joke about that and put those most aggressive parts on display and prime each other to pick up on the aggressive features they hear and to interpret them as aggressive. But maybe the number one reason we make fun of Norwegian isn't because they're happier than us and we're just jealous, or because we simply always have made fun of them for everything, but because our languages are so similar. It's like looking in the mirror, and we don't always like what we find. Norwegian and Swedish both have pitch accent, where every word has a set tone contour which, when combined with stress and intonation patterns, makes the sentence as a whole go up and down in a kind of weird way. They both have certain sounds that the rest of Europe also doesn't have. The thing is, I think Swedish sounds kind of silly to the rest of Europe. I think Norwegian and Swedish both do, and kind of for similar reasons. I don't know, you tell me, what are your subjective opinions about the native languages of millions of people? Anyway, I love Norwegian, I love how it sounds. Thank you to everyone who helped me make this video, and I will be back relatively soon with an actual video about actual linguistics. Vet du vad torsk heter på norska? Ja, det heter torsk. Såklart, ja. Vet du vad haj heter på norska då? Kämpetorsk. Ja, fattar du? Eller hajar du? Ja.